They told her she didn't have the strength, the instincts, or the courage to make it in combat. Some whispered it behind her back, others said it straight to her face. But when the firefight began and seasoned men bolted for cover, she ran the other way, into the fire. By the time the dust cleared, she had saved over 50 lives and changed the course of her unit forever. This is the story of a woman the military tried to overlook, and how she became a legend when no one was watching. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Nobody remembered her the first week she arrived at Camp Westvale, tucked deep into the desert landscape of Al Rayyan. The sun there was merciless, the wind sharp with sand, and the perimeter always buzzing with the threat of insurgent skirmishes. Westvale was a forward operating base that most hoped to rotate out of quickly. It wasn't where heroes were made, it was where discipline held the line between routine and disaster. When Private First Class Kaela Moreno stepped off the transport vehicle, her boots touched the ground with the same weight as any of the other dozen soldiers arriving with her. But the glances she got were different. A few skeptical looks, a raised eyebrow, and one loud snort of laughter when she struggled with the locking mechanism on her duffel. She wasn't short, but she was leaner than most, with a wiry frame and alert eyes that scanned everything with the sharpness of someone who didn't want to be caught off guard. She didn't talk much, didn't swagger, and certainly didn't snap back when Sergeant Booker, her assigned squad leader, grumbled that he didn't have time to babysit anyone who still looked like she should be working logistics or nursing. Keela had expected the resistance. Even before boot camp, she knew what kind of uphill climb she was in for. Her father had been a career Army officer, and her older brother, a decorated combat medic, both of them skeptical about her choice to pursue infantry. "It's different for you," her brother had said once, not with cruelty, but with something that sounded almost like fear. She understood what he meant. She wasn't the kind to brawl in the mess hall or bark orders louder than anyone else. But she knew how to move, how to calculate, and most of all, how to endure. The Army would never give her the benefit of the doubt, and she had made peace with that long ago. At Camp Westvale, she did what she always did: watched, learned, trained harder than anyone else, and spoke only when necessary. In the evenings, when most of the unit unwound in the rec hall or clutched video calls with families back home, Kayla ran drills alone. Climbing, crawling, checking and rechecking her gear, she was never late for inspections, never flinched in drills, and never missed a shot during live-fire training. Still, the nickname stuck faster than any of her commendations. Featherweight. Some said it to her face with a smirk. Others muttered it like a warning. A few didn't even know her real name. Her platoon had been stationed at Westvale for 5 weeks when the tension started creeping into their routines. Communications from the Northern Ridge patrols became less frequent. Recon drones were coming back with static or strange interference. Rumors spread about a new rebel cell with tactical-level coordination, something none of them had faced before. While some brushed it off as paranoia, Kaela noticed the shift in tone during the commander briefings. The officers weren't panicking, but they were preparing. The guards at night doubled. Trucks were parked ready for rapid deployment. No one admitted it outright, but Westvale was expecting something bad. Kaela's own squad was assigned to night patrol along the southern perimeter, a position typically quieter but vulnerable to flanking maneuvers. She took the assignment without question, falling into rhythm with her fire team even if they still barely looked her in the eye. The desert at night had a silence that could play tricks on the mind. Every creak of gear, every breath felt amplified. Her squad leader, Booker, still barked orders with the assumption she'd be the one lagging behind or missing a mark. But Kaela didn't react. She didn't need to prove anything to him. Not yet. She didn't know that in less than 72 hours everything would change, that an ambush was being planned, that insurgents had been watching Westvale's routines for weeks, mapping their weaknesses. That on a hot and windless afternoon, while half the base rotated back from night shifts and the other half conducted vehicle maintenance, 3 enemy trucks rigged with explosives and dozens of armed rebels would descend on the base's east gate. She didn't know that the surprise would be so total that it would throw experienced Marines into a frenzy of confusion and panic, or that the only person who would hold the eastern corridor that day, without orders, without backup, would be her. Kaela Moreno, the one they called too weak for combat, would become the reason over 50 men and women made it out alive. But for now, all she did was wait, train, and listen, because she knew her moment was coming. And when it did, there would be no one else to answer the call. Kaela Moreno had never fit into anyone's mold, not in her hometown of Silver Bluff, not at Fort Pennington during training, and certainly not now in the unforgiving terrain of Al Rayyan. She was born to a family steeped in military tradition. Her father, Lieutenant Colonel Ruben Moreno, had earned 2 Bronze Stars before retiring with a spine held together by pins and regret. Her older brother, Marcus, was the kind of soldier that drill sergeants pointed to as an example, strong-jawed and bellowing with purpose, a combat medic with steady hands and a chest full of ribbons. Kaela had been the quiet one, the kid with books instead of biceps, the girl whose favorite place was in the shadows of libraries and silent mornings at the gun range, where she learned to focus not by shouting commands, but by slowing her breath and reading the rhythm of stillness. She wasn't flashy, she wasn't loud, but even at 16, when she passed the Army physical on her first try, with no special prep, and nailed a bullseye at 300 yards, her father had only raised an eyebrow as if to say, "That won't be enough out there." Maybe it wasn't, but it was a start. In high school, Kaela had chosen the hardest subjects, the most thankless part-time jobs, and volunteered for things no one else wanted. Cleaning up the shooting range after competitions, reshelving books in the ROTC archives, cataloging uniforms and gear when the senior cadets were too lazy to do it. She wasn't trying to earn praise. She simply wanted to understand what made a good soldier beneath all the performance. That curiosity turned into discipline, and that discipline turned into obsession. While her classmates were sneaking beers and comparing college rejections, she was running uphill drills with a weighted vest and memorizing field medicine protocols. She didn't look like a fighter, not with her narrow shoulders and calm face, but there was a quiet edge in her eyes that said she was waiting, perhaps for the moment she would be tested, perhaps for the moment she would finally silence the voices that said she didn't belong. Boot camp didn't change her, but it exposed the cracks in everyone else. Recruits twice her size dropped out during the 5th week. One girl had a panic attack during live fire training. Another tore a tendon halfway through a night march and never came back. Kaela never led the charge, but she never lagged behind either. She carried her own gear, never complained, and when she shot, she rarely missed. But she didn't bond with the others. The cliques formed quickly, those who came from military families, those who played sports, those who wanted to prove something loud and fast. Kaela, despite her lineage, was always an outlier. She didn't trade war stories, didn't flirt, didn't gossip. She studied patterns, learned chain of command procedures better than anyone, and shadowed every instructor she could without being obvious. When Sergeant Paris handed back the final combat drills evaluation with only a nod, Kaela didn't smile, though she felt something shift inside her chest. Not pride, not relief, just confirmation that her instincts were working. Her assignment to Camp Westvale wasn't glamorous. It was barely mentioned in her orders, a forward position in a hostile zone, minimal comfort, likely zero recognition. But that was exactly why Kaela had wanted it. She knew the only way to prove herself wasn't in parade formations or at medal ceremonies. It was in places where no one was watching. Westvale was that kind of place. Hot, isolated, dull on the surface, but coiled underneath with a tension that made her gut tighten every time the radio cracked to life. She was assigned to Echo Platoon, mostly Marines rotating in from coastal bases who viewed Army infantry with detached amusement. The moment she stepped into the barracks, she was treated like an accessory to the squad. More paperwork than partner, Sergeant Booker didn't hide his disdain. He was a grizzled vet with a limp, a sharp tongue, and a belief that women didn't belong outside of admin roles unless they were pulling perimeter watch on a desk job. Kaela made no effort to change his mind. She let her consistency do the talking. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Day after day, she outlasted the others in endurance drills, passed every weapons check, and even caught a malfunction on one of the squad's MRAP vehicles that the motor pool had missed. But it didn't matter. They still called her featherweight. One night during rations, she overheard Private Langley joke that if insurgents ever hit the base, Kayla would be the first to hide under a truck. She didn't respond. She knew that being underestimated was more useful than feared. Let them laugh, she thought. Let them assume she was fragile, soft, expendable. Because when the storm finally hit, and she was sure it would, they'd remember her, not her face, not her silence, but what she did when it mattered. And so, Kayla settled into her routine, up before dawn, checking gear that others sloppily packed, scouting every blind spot on their patrol routes, studying maps when no one was looking, listening to local dialects during briefings and quietly taking notes. No one had asked her to prepare like this. No one had even given her a chance to lead. But Kayla wasn't preparing for approval. She was preparing for war. And in less than 3 days, the war would come not in waves, but in a single instant that would turn Westvale from just another desert station into a battlefield written into military reports and whispered about in barracks around the globe. But when it happened, Kayla wouldn't be caught off guard. She had already been waiting. Camp Westvale was not a place people remembered fondly. Situated in the dry heart of the Al Rayyan Desert, it sat like a forgotten scratch in the earth, surrounded by blistered hills and an endless spread of cracked terrain. The winds came hot and unpredictable, often carrying the scent of gunpowder from somewhere far away, or the acrid sting of oil fires from rebel-controlled fields. The camp itself was practical to the point of cruelty. Bare-bones structures built from prefabricated metal panels, scattered generators that rattled endlessly, and rows of barracks so close together you could hear the snores and murmurs of the soldier next door, even if you didn't want to. There was no real privacy, only a shared discomfort that bonded the soldiers like dry rot bonds would. Every corner of Westvale felt temporary, as if it were built with the knowledge it might not survive the season. The perimeter was enclosed by high fencing, reinforced with barbed wire, sensors, and heavy concrete barriers, but no one really believed it was impenetrable. The true defense of Westvale came from vigilance. The patrols, the drills, the constant awareness that out beyond the last watchtower were enemies who knew the terrain far better than they did. The nearest town, Kadar, was 30 miles south, once a minor hub of trade, but now largely abandoned, save for a few families who refused to leave their land despite the instability. Convoys rarely ventured that way unless absolutely necessary, and when they did, they returned with grim stories and bullet-ridden tires. Inside the camp, routines ran like clockwork, more out of necessity than discipline. Every hour had its task, and every soldier moved like part of a machine, rusted and creaking, but still functional. Mess was at 0600, then again at 1800, always the same powdered eggs, mystery meat, and rice. Weapons checks were daily, drills rotated weekly. At night, the floodlights flicked on and the guards doubled, pacing the perimeter with rifles slung low and eyes darting between movement and shadow. Kayla had memorized every inch of the camp within her first week. She knew which corners gathered dust, which sandbags had started to split, and where the blind spots were between cameras. She studied the timing of vehicle movements, the way fuel was stored, the angle of approach that the sun took every morning when it rose over the eastern hill crest. Most of the soldiers didn't bother with such details. They moved through Westvale like it was just another pit stop, assuming they'd rotate out before anything serious happened. But Westvale had a history, one that veterans spoke of only in hushed voices. 5 years earlier, a surprise raid had left 12 dead and several wounded after a failed radio relay during a sandstorm. Since then, the base had been rebuilt with better comms, stronger perimeters, and more aggressive patrol policies. But it had never been considered safe. Too close to rebel territory, too far from reinforcements. It was a place where greenhorns were tested and where careers either ended quietly or were forged in fire. Those who had survived the earlier attack never really let their guard down again, even as new recruits came in and out like passing wind. That sense of unease hung over everything, like a shadow no light could erase. Kayla found comfort in the details others ignored. She took notes on shifts, studied how the guards rotated, and learned the rhythms of the camp. She noticed the pacing of Lieutenant Granger, who limped on his right leg and favored the tower near the comms building. She tracked the fuel truck schedule and realized there were 3 full minutes between shifts where no one monitored the north-facing motor pool gate. She even learned the unofficial signals passed between the satellite operators and the drone handlers, recognizing when a surveillance failure was being covered up with technical jargon. None of this was part of her job description, but it gave her a sense of control, of preparation. Because the landscape outside the wire was indifferent and cruel, and the only way to survive it was to respect it more than it respected you. The terrain beyond Westvale was more enemy than backdrop. A vast plain of orange and rust-colored sand, punctuated by jagged rock formations and shallow ravines that provided perfect cover for small ambush squads or snipers. Vegetation was sparse, mostly scrubby bushes and sun-bleached thorns that seemed to sprout from stone itself. The rebels knew how to vanish into this terrain. They traveled light, hit fast, and never attacked the same place twice. Every time a drone lost signal or a patrol came back late, the entire camp tensed. It wasn't a question of if something would happen, it was a question of when. And then there was the heat. The kind of heat that blurred the horizon, melted boot soles, and turned metal searing to the touch. It crept into your lungs, dried out your skin, and made tempers snap with no provocation. It was relentless, punishing, and ever-present. At Westvale, hydration was a form of religion. Anyone who passed out during drills was jeered for being careless. Kayla never once failed a heat check, never showed a single sign of sunstroke, even as others faltered under its weight. She adapted, endured, became part of the harsh landscape rather than fighting against it. In many ways, she felt more at home under that oppressive sun than she ever had in classrooms or family dinners. Westvale may have looked like a collection of crumbling structures and tired routines, but Kayla saw it for what it truly was, a powder keg with a short fuse, surrounded by dry brush and flammable air. She saw the cracks in its foundation, the blind spots in its defenses, the gaps in its leadership's assumptions, and though no one had asked her to do anything more than follow orders and keep her weapon clean, Kayla watched, waited, and prepared. Because she knew places like Westvale didn't just fall under attack, they invited it. And when that moment finally came, when all the routines collapsed and the smoke swallowed the sun, she would be ready. The enemy didn't wear uniforms. They didn't march in lines or announce themselves with flags and formations. They slipped through cracks, shadowed convoys from distant ridges, and studied routines with a predator's patience. The rebel faction in Al Rayyan, loosely known as the Garrett Coalition, was not a conventional army, but a shape-shifting force of insurgents, informants, and opportunists, whose one consistency was their hatred of foreign presence. They had grown bolder in the past 6 months, capitalizing on the lull between major deployments and exploiting intelligence blind spots created by bureaucratic reshuffling back in the capital. They rarely struck head-on. They preferred sabotage, sniping, and ambushes, operations that left soldiers dead without ever seeing who killed them. Their tactics were evolving, and Westvale, with its reputation as a dead-end assignment, had become an ideal target. Though there was no one face to the enemy, Kayla began to notice signs of coordination that suggested someone or something was directing them with far more precision than the official reports acknowledged. Over a 2-week span, she logged 6 drone communication failures over the eastern quadrant of the base's surveillance range. Each time, the signal went dead at nearly the same coordinates, just past a broken stretch of desert rock known as Widow's Spine. Patrols near that area reported strange tire markings, signs of movement that disappeared with the wind, and the occasional glint of light at dusk that vanished too quickly to track. Command chalked it up to technical interference and environmental factors. But Kayla didn't believe in that many coincidences. What unsettled her most wasn't what she saw. It was what others ignored. Reports went unread. Warnings were downplayed. The top brass believed the rebel factions were too disorganized to launch any real offensive against a fortified post like Westvale. Intelligence briefings emphasized low risk, high caution, and continued protocol. It was a lull, they insisted. Tension, yes, but nothing unusual. Kayla disagreed. There was a rhythm to the enemy's silence, a kind of deliberate pause that reminded her of a held breath before a scream. She felt it in her bones. The camp was being watched, tested, studied, and whoever was behind it was learning faster than anyone expected. Rumors swirled quietly among the more seasoned soldiers. There was talk of a man known only by his call sign, the Jackal. No photos, no confirmed sightings, but a growing list of attacks across the southern quadrant, all bearing his signature. Coordinated hits, psychological manipulation, the use of captured enemy uniforms and vehicles to infiltrate and confuse before striking. He was said to be a former military strategist turned mercenary leader, using his training against the very institutions that once shaped him. Officially, the Army denied his existence. Off the record, several squad leaders admitted that the sudden spike in precision ambushes felt different, calculated, surgical, personal. Kayla didn't know if the Jackal was real, but she understood the danger of underestimating an enemy who had time, terrain, and motive on their side. She observed how the camp grew sloppier as the false sense of security settled in. Morale didn't dip, it got lazy. Soldiers became comfortable skipping radio checks or ignoring curfew drills. The leadership dismissed drill failures as fatigue rather than warning signs. Kayla noticed one of the eastern towers had a camera that lagged by nearly 8 seconds, an eternity in tactical time. She reported it twice. Nothing was done. Meanwhile, the pattern intensified. A supply convoy en route from Kadar vanished without distress calls. A patrol found the burned-out remains 2 days later, stripped of gear but left arranged in a deliberate formation, bodies in a circle, weapons pointing outward. It was a message. But the higher-ups called it symbolic noise. Kayla knew better. Someone was preparing the battlefield not just to attack, but to break Westvale's spirit before the first shot was fired. And then came the first real breach. A silent strike at an outpost tower 3 miles east of the main gate. 2 guards killed with precision shots between the helmet and vest line, 1 communications panel disabled, and 0 footprints. No alarms were triggered. By the time backup arrived, the tower was empty. The only evidence a knife driven into the console with a scrawled word in charcoal on the wall behind it. Observed. Command increased patrols for a week, then downgraded the threat again. When nothing further happened, Kayla could feel it tightening like a noose. The enemy wasn't just testing defenses, they were monitoring reactions. They were gathering psychological intelligence. Her squad remained largely oblivious to the bigger picture. Sergeant Booker was too occupied with reasserting control over his team, venting frustrations during drills, and mocking Kayla whenever she corrected procedural lapses. She became the unofficial errand runner, sent to recheck storage logs, fetch water, clean the Humvee turrets, not because she lacked skill, but because no one took her seriously enough to assign her anything critical. That was fine by her. The more they dismissed her, the more room she had to prepare unnoticed. She began quietly building a contingency plan of her own. She mapped escape routes no one had marked. She traced lines of sight from guard towers to see where coverage failed. She memorized supply cache locations and noted which buildings had reinforced walls. She even stored a backup medkit in a generator shed near the east gate, just in case. While others trained for standard scenarios, Kayla planned for the day everything would go wrong. Because the enemy wasn't coming with banners or tanks. They were coming in silence, with precision, and a hunger to humiliate. And when they came, it wouldn't be the loudest, the strongest, or the most decorated who would decide what happened next. It would be the one person who saw the truth while everyone else was blind. Kayla Moreno didn't need a promotion or applause. She needed one moment, and it was closer than anyone knew. Training with Echo Company in the dry, grueling heat of Fort Claremont became more than just a trial of strength for Lena. It became a psychological battlefield. Every morning while the others stood shoulder to shoulder, she often found herself slightly off to the side, not out of choice, but because her presence didn't yet command the same respect. She knew they watched her, not to learn, but to wait, for her to fail, for her to stumble, for their assumptions to be proven true. She was smaller, lighter, and less muscular than most of the men, but none of them could see the sheer volume of mental conditioning she had already endured just to stand there at all. As days turned into weeks, Lena woke before dawn, not to win favor, but to escape their stares. She'd run laps before roll call, carry sandbags long after drills had ended, not as punishment, but to harden every weakness they had ever accused her of. There were no exceptions in combat, she reminded herself, and she would give them none to throw back at her. By the third month, she started matching the squad leaders in endurance drills. Captain Rowden began to notice. He was a quiet observer, rarely gave out compliments, but when he walked past her after a successful navigation through the obstacle course and gave her a single nod, Lena felt the fire inside her grow. It wasn't approval she craved, it was acknowledgement, yet still, others refused to let go of their disdain. One night, in the barracks, she overheard Corporal Vincent laughing that she'd never carry a fallen Marine out of a kill zone. That girl couldn't lift a backpack without breaking a nail, he chuckled. Lena didn't respond. She didn't confront, she wrote it down, quietly. Another line in her internal ledger, another promise she made to herself. She would prove him wrong. Not through words, not through confrontation, but in the only language they all respected, action. Then came the real test, deployment simulations. These were designed to mimic live war zones in unfamiliar terrain, complete with timed rescues, hostile fire simulations, and urban combat drills. Lena excelled. Not with brute strength, but with adaptability, precision, and a razor-sharp instinct that most of them hadn't yet refined. During a hostage extraction exercise, she was the first to spot the sniper nest others missed. In a night ops drill, she navigated through a blackout warehouse and extracted the wounded dummy faster than any of the male counterparts. Slowly, begrudgingly, some of the whispers started to shift from mockery to curiosity. Not admiration, at least, not yet. But she was no longer the company joke. She was an anomaly, something they couldn't quite dismiss. But not everyone was willing to reconsider. Sergeant Hale, who oversaw most of their field training, remained particularly harsh. He never used her name. Always private, or worse, you. During gear inspections, he'd linger at her bunk, searching for something, anything, out of place. When she passed, he'd grunt. When she stumbled, even slightly, he'd roar louder than necessary. It became clear to Lena that he wasn't just testing her endurance, he was trying to break it. On one particularly grueling 24-hour survival drill, Hale sent her to scout a steep ridgeline alone, despite regulations that dictated a buddy system. When she returned, blistered and bleeding from the underbrush, with the full recon report completed, he offered no comment. But Captain Rowden did. He began assigning her to point positions during drills, roles that required split-second decision-making, leadership under fire, and the trust of others. That's when things began to shift. Slowly, the rest of the squad began to realize Lena wasn't just surviving, she was excelling. During a simulated ambush, she pulled Private Mendez to cover when he froze, shielding him until reinforcements arrived. During a failed communications drill, it was Lena who re-established a signal using only emergency gear and a little improvisation with a discarded antenna. These weren't accidents. They were habits. Born not of ego, but of obsession. She had spent her entire training building an arsenal of reliability, and now it was being seen. A few of the men started sitting near her during meals. Corporal Vinson, the same one who had laughed before, once asked how she'd rerouted the comms. She explained briefly, and he nodded, not mockingly, but with genuine interest. But the real turn didn't come until Echo Company was selected for a live field training deployment to the Black Ridge Terrain Zone, a remote and hostile stretch of canyon and forest used by the military to simulate high-intensity combat operations. It was known for unpredictable weather, unstable terrain, and stress scenarios involving, quote, enemy combatants with advanced tactics. No one had ever gone through it without at least one evacuation. It was the final phase, before active duty qualification for Echo Company. And Lena knew this would be the arena that decided her fate. Not just whether she'd pass, but whether she'd earn her place in their eyes. Every doubt, every whispered insult, every scoff would either be solidified or silenced out there. As they boarded the carrier for insertion into Black Ridge, Lena sat silently, checking her gear, replaying every mental note she had taken. Around her, the tension was thick. They were no longer training. This was as close to war as it got without bullets. She could feel eyes on her again, but they weren't filled with contempt anymore. They were watching to see what she would do, how she'd act, whether she'd choke or rise. She tightened her harness, adjusted her rifle, and whispered to herself the same words she had since the beginning. Not to prove them wrong, but to prove herself right. Sergeant Caleb Wren had barely slept when he received the transfer order. He glanced down at the document twice, not because he doubted what it said, but because he couldn't believe someone had finally listened. Eloise Ray, the so-called too-weak-for-combat corporal, was now officially reassigned to Echo Company, not as a logistics aide, not as a field support liaison, but as an active member of a forward combat squad. The very squad that had spent 6 months operating along the Sandhaven Ridge, the most volatile line on the entire eastern flank. Wren rubbed the back of his neck and muttered to himself, half expecting the order to be revoked before he even met her. He knew who she was. Everyone did by now. The girl who didn't break under pressure but under assumptions. The soldier who survived Hellfire training only to be shoved into a clerical tent. And yet, here she was. Coming into the lion's den, Echo Company didn't take kindly to new blood, especially not blood they'd heard was delicate. That morning, as the dust settled from a routine perimeter patrol, Wren gathered the squad for introductions. Eloise arrived 15 minutes later, gear spotless, helmet clipped at her side, face unreadable. There was no salute, just a nod. Some of the men crossed their arms. Others smirked, their eyes flicking to one another as if waiting for her to trip, or stammer, or say something naive. But she didn't. Wren broke the silence and walked over. She extended her hand first. "Corporal Ray reporting," she said, voice steady. Wren shook it without hesitation. "You'll be under my direct command," he said, then turned to the rest of the group. "She's been cleared for full operations. Treat her like any of you." There was a long pause before a corporal in the back let out a light scoff. "Guess paperwork's getting desperate," he muttered. Eloise didn't flinch. She met his gaze and smiled faintly. Wren caught the exchange but let it slide. He'd seen this before. The quiet ones were often the most dangerous, not in a reckless sense, but in how they dismantled expectations with patience. Over the next 3 weeks, Eloise joined the squad for every patrol, every drill, and every godforsaken ration run up the East Hill. She was fast, precise, and always the first to volunteer for recon sweeps, especially in terrain the others hesitated to cross. Wren took note. So did the others, even if they didn't say much. It wasn't until the second week of October that everything changed. Echo was tasked with sweeping Sector DELTA-9, a ravine surrounded by narrow cliffs with barely there visibility. Command suspected enemy movement through the ridge, but lacked confirmation. Echo's mission was to go in, check the route, and return. Simple. Clean, at least on paper. Ren divided the team into 3 fire teams, assigning Eloise to Bravo under Sergeant Jin. The descent into the ravine was slow, tension threading the air like coiled wire. No one spoke. Just boots crunching over gravel and the distant echo of birds that didn't seem scared enough. Halfway through the pass, something felt off. Eloise noticed it first. She paused, eyes scanning the treetops. There was a pattern. Too much stillness in one section and the smell. It was faint, but unnatural, metallic, burnt, and cold. She tapped Jin's shoulder, motioning for a halt. He hesitated but followed the signal. She pointed toward a rock formation up ahead, something oddly placed. Then she crouched and picked up a stone, perfectly round, too round, and scraped it. Paint. Not dirt. Not dust. Camouflage. That's when the first shot rang out. The ambush was instant. Gunfire exploded from the cliffs, spraying the path ahead. Echo scattered, ducking for cover as comms screamed to life. Ren's voice barked across the channel, demanding positions and status updates. Bravo was pinned, caught in the narrowest part of the gorge. Jin took a hit to the shoulder, and the medic was already tending to a corporal with shrapnel in his leg. Eloise was calm. She dragged Jin behind cover and grabbed the squad's long-range scanner. The cliffs above were peppered with enemy positions, cleverly concealed, but not unreachable. She remembered a maneuver from advanced training that most had called impractical in real situations, scaling behind enemy cover using terrain curvature and suppressed leap points. No one ever used it, but it was all she had. She relayed the plan to Ren in rapid bursts. "I need a distraction fire," burst West. "I'll flank from the rise. They won't expect elevation." Ren, pinned down himself, responded, "You'll be exposed." She replied, "They're expecting us to freeze." There was a beat. Then, go. Eloise darted sideways, breaking into a sprint along the gorge wall, dodging fire with terrifying precision. She threw a smoke grenade, not forward, but behind, masking her exit instead of her target. Then she leapt onto the rise, fingers gripping stone, boots finding leverage where there was barely foothold. She climbed, blood pounding, lungs burning. Bullets sang past her head, but she kept going. Up, around, over, until she disappeared from sight. The cliff shook as a flashbang detonated somewhere above, then a series of muffled shots. Silence followed. Echo waited, weapons trained, and then, over the comms, her voice. 3 hostiles down, upper cliff secure. The squad stared in disbelief. Ren blinked hard, then shouted for the others to move. In the chaos, Eloise had flanked the entire enemy nest and dismantled their main hold point. The attack crumbled. By dusk, the firefight had ended. Echo had taken losses, but without her move, they would have been wiped out. She hadn't just saved her squad. She'd saved nearly 50 Marines, and she'd done it when everyone else had either hesitated or followed orders. That night, as Ren walked into the makeshift command tent, he saw something that stunned him more than anything that day. The same corporal who once scoffed at Eloise now stood beside her, handing her a canteen without a word. Respect, given quietly, authentically, earned. Elena's return to the base brought with it a quiet transformation. The fire mission in Bakar Ridge had left her physically exhausted, but spiritually recharged. There was a newfound resilience in her gaze, an inner strength that didn't need to be spoken aloud. The whispers that had once mocked her softness now shifted in tone, not out of admiration, not yet, but out of uncertainty. It was as if those around her could feel something changing beneath the surface, like a fault line preparing to shift. Captain Hollins didn't say much when she walked back into the command tent, her uniform dirt-streaked, face drawn but unbroken. He simply looked up from a table littered with maps and nodded. That nod, brief as it was, meant more than any word of praise. She hadn't just proven she could hold her own, she'd shown she could lead. But that didn't mean the battle was over, not by a long shot. In the days that followed, Elena's unit was moved south toward a more fortified sector near the Kairos River. Intelligence suggested the insurgents had been regrouping, planning a mass offensive against the front. The 21st Marine Recon, the very unit that had doubted Elena's place among them, was to hold the line while reinforcements were redirected from the east. It was a tactical delay, 2 weeks to buy time, but every soldier knew what that meant. 2 weeks in a kill zone. Elena didn't flinch. While others grumbled, she studied maps, ran drills with the unit, and volunteered for double shifts. When her fellow Marines showed signs of wear, she stepped in, not with grand speeches or empty encouragements, but by carrying more than her share of the weight. She cleaned weapons with Private Lang when he struggled with his tremors. She sparred with Corporal Jessup at dusk and beat him in 4 out of 5 bouts, earning a reluctant but respectful grunt. Sergeant Boyle still kept his distance. He wasn't openly hostile anymore, but his silence was like a wall. It was during a routine night patrol that the wall finally cracked. The unit had been split into pairs, sweeping the ravine trails west of camp. Elena and Boyle were assigned together, an accident of scheduling, or maybe fate. For the first 30 minutes, they moved in silence, checking vantage points, scanning ridgelines. Then, without warning, a rustling behind the brush to their left sent adrenaline coursing through their veins. Boyle dropped to one knee, weapon raised. Elena followed, scanning with infrared. It was a stray goat, tagged with orange paint. Boyle lowered his rifle, exhaling slowly. Elena chuckled. He looked at her, annoyed, then smirked. It wasn't much, but it was something. Later that night, as they made their way back, Boyle spoke. He didn't apologize, didn't explain his past actions. He just said, "You don't scare easy." Elena responded, "Neither do you." That was enough. From that moment on, there was no more avoiding her, no more dismissive nods. Instead, Boyle became her fiercest advocate. He corrected others when they mocked her, backed her decisions during ops meetings, and even started asking for her input before each mission. Slowly, the others followed suit. By the 10th day on the Kairos line, Elena had become a quiet pillar within the unit, not loud, not flashy, but undeniable. She coordinated defensive positions that reduced casualties. She initiated a nighttime decoy tactic using heat signatures from salvaged gear to draw enemy sniper fire away from living targets. Her innovations saved lives. Even Hollins, who had long kept his evaluations clinical and detached, began referring to her as essential. Elena still didn't seek attention. She let her actions speak. And they did, volumes. But the war had a way of testing even the strongest. On the 12th day, just as dusk fell over the valley, and the wind carried a chill that felt too quiet, too still, the insurgents launched their assault. It started with mortar fire, then small arms, and finally a full frontal rush that no one had anticipated. The southern perimeter crumbled under pressure, and communications with HQ were severed. Panic rippled through the ranks. A junior officer froze during triage coordination. Half of Recon Alpha retreated toward the river, breaking formation. Elena, seeing the chaos unfold, took a deep breath and moved without hesitation. She rushed into the command tent, eyes scanning the board. Hollins was down, wounded in the leg, trying to instruct through gritted teeth. Elena took charge, not with a power grab, but with clarity. She reassigned squads, ordered a counterflank maneuver using the eastern ridge, and redirected medical evac to the rocky outcrop shielded from direct fire. Then she did what no one else dared. She ran into the breach. Not behind it, not beside it. She ran forward, directly into the path where the line had broken, her rifle drawn, eyes fixed. Marines who had scattered saw her and stopped. Some thought she was crazy. Others thought she was brave. What mattered was that they followed. A squad of 12 regrouped behind her. She ordered suppressive fire. A second squad formed a pincer from the north. The insurgents, caught in crossfire and confused by the sudden reorganization, began to falter. What was supposed to be a rout became a standoff, and as the hours dragged into dawn, Elena kept pushing. By the time reinforcements arrived, the 21st had held the line. Barely, but they had, and they had because one Marine, once called too weak, had refused to run. That day, 50 lives were saved because of her decisions, not luck, not brute strength, but courage, clarity, and the kind of leadership that rises only when everything else collapses. As medics treated the wounded and the dust began to settle, Elena stood on the ridge, blood streaking her arm, eyes fixed on the horizon. Not for glory, not for praise, but because the mission wasn't done. And neither was she. The desert heat was unrelenting, pressing down like a physical weight, making every movement an effort, every breath thick with dust and dry air. Captain Eva Ramirez crouched behind the remnants of a crumbled stone wall, her heart hammering against her chest, as distant gunfire echoed across the broken terrain. The ambush had come without warning, an orchestrated strategic strike that scattered their convoy and pinned half of the unit behind makeshift cover miles from base. For the last 2 hours, they had been in a state of tactical paralysis, separated from command, their comms scrambled by enemy jammers, and morale dangerously thin. Some Marines were wounded, supplies were low, and no one could confirm how many insurgents were out there. The only thing they knew was that it was too many. Eva had taken command in the chaos when the actual commanding officer, Lieutenant Westbrook, was incapacitated by shrapnel to the leg. She had dragged him behind cover, applied a tourniquet, and barked orders that pulled the team back from a complete rout. Still, the weight of being thrust into command in the most hostile circumstances was not lost on her. Every decision now was hers. Every life, those of the 50 Marines scattered across the ambush site, rested on her judgment, and she knew full well that many of them still doubted her. Even now, under siege, some glanced sideways when she spoke, their hesitation thinly veiled, like they were waiting for someone more qualified to emerge from the rubble and tell them what to do. She didn't have time to dwell on their doubts. There were 3 key problems they needed to solve if they wanted to get out of this. First, recover the comms to signal for air support or backup. Second, rescue the cut-off half of their team on the other side of the ridge. And third, do it all while under fire, with wounded Marines and dwindling ammunition. Eva had studied a topographical map of the region just the day before, the kind of thing her superiors never expected her to waste time on because she was only a medic, and remembered a narrow canyon that curved behind the ridge. It wasn't visible from the convoy route, and it didn't appear on most of the digital mission maps, but it might be their one shot at flanking the enemy undetected. She laid out the plan to her team. No one said anything outright, but she saw it in their eyes. Doubt, fear, the quiet resistance of Marines who'd been trained to believe leadership had to look and sound a certain way, but they followed her. She split them into 3 fire teams, designating roles with sharp efficiency. She assigned herself to the most dangerous task, leading the flanking maneuver through the canyon with 5 Marines, while the others created a diversion. It was a risk, but Eva knew it was one they had to take. The alternative was waiting to be picked off one by one or surrendering to an enemy that didn't take prisoners. As they snuck through the canyon, every step was a balancing act between stealth and speed. Eva took point, navigating the tight rock formations while listening for any sign they'd been discovered. Her senses were heightened to the point where even the shift of a pebble underfoot felt like a potential disaster. At one point, the group paused, hearing what sounded like footsteps echoing through the narrow walls. They flattened against the rocks, hearts pounding, fingers ready on triggers. But it turned out to be an animal, darting through the brush. Ava didn't let relief settle. She motioned them forward, pace quickening. The canyon emerged behind a bluff, overlooking the enemy's position. From there, they could see the insurgents, dug in behind overturned vehicles and debris. Ava's heart sank as she counted them. There were at least 20, heavily armed and prepared. But they hadn't accounted for a rear assault. Ava gave the signal. Her team opened fire, catching the insurgents completely off guard. Explosions erupted as grenades were lobbed into enemy nests. The ambushers scrambled in panic. Simultaneously, the other fire teams, hearing the assault begin, launched their own diversionary attack from the front. Caught between two fronts, the enemy formation crumbled. In the chaos, Ava saw one of her men go down. Without thinking, she sprinted into open ground, dragged him back to cover, and administered aid. The bullets ricocheted around her. One grazed her arm, another struck the ground inches from her face. But she didn't stop until she stabilized the Marine and handed him off to another. Then she was back in the fight. Within minutes, the ambush collapsed entirely. Those who weren't taken down retreated into the desert, leaving behind weapons, gear, and stunned silence. The Marines, exhausted, dirt-covered, some bleeding, others too shocked to speak, regrouped. Ava took a head count. All 50 Marines were alive. A few seriously wounded, but none dead. It was a miracle, and a result of tactical precision, sheer nerve, and leadership under pressure. The silence that followed the gunfire was heavy, and then, slowly, something shifted. One by one, the Marines looked at Ava not with doubt or hesitation, but with something new: respect. One of them, the same corporal who had once questioned if she could even handle a rifle, walked over and said nothing, just nodded. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes. Ava didn't respond. She didn't need to. This wasn't about proving anyone wrong anymore. It was about proving something to herself, that she could lead, protect, and fight just as fiercely as anyone else. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows over the battlefield they had just reclaimed, Ava finally allowed herself a breath, the first deep breath in what felt like a lifetime. They had survived. She had led them through it. And now, the war within, the one that had raged between self-doubt and determination, had shifted in her favor. She was no longer the medic they underestimated. She was the leader they had needed all along. The desert sun was unrelenting, casting a haze over the horizon as the convoy rattled forward across the sand-rutted path. Each jolt of the armored vehicle was a reminder of how unstable and dangerous this region remained. Sergeant Elena Ramirez sat in the third Humvee, eyes locked forward, mind calculating possibilities. She had always been hyper-aware in the field, never complacent, never unprepared. And today, her senses were screaming louder than usual. Captain Durant had approved the recon sweep despite her objections, brushing off her warnings about local insurgent chatter and missing civilian intel. But Elena wasn't one to sit on her hands. She'd packed extra med kits, reviewed their map twice, and prepped her team for every possible scenario she could imagine in the time they had. The first hour rolled by with tense silence, everyone alert, adrenaline pulsing quietly beneath their composed exteriors. Dust devils twisted in the distance, and the wind carried with it the ghost of past explosions and gunfire. They passed a deserted village where Elena's gaze lingered on a half-collapsed minaret. Its shadow stretched like a warning across the wreckage of buildings that once held life. She knew something was off. The kind of silence they were driving through wasn't peaceful. It was anticipatory. Just as they crested the low ridge toward a makeshift bridge, everything erupted. An IED detonated under the lead vehicle with a thunderous blast, lifting it into the air before slamming it sideways into the dried riverbed. Fire tore through the undercarriage as chaos exploded. The convoy halted, but before orders could even be shouted, they were under fire from two flanks. Rounds peppered the side of the vehicles like hail. Elena didn't freeze. Her training and instincts kicked in with brutal clarity. While others ducked for cover or hesitated, she was already moving, issuing sharp orders, breaking formation and flanking left toward the tailing fire group. She coordinated with Corporal Singh to lay smoke cover while rallying the nearest Marines to follow her counter-advance. The ambush had been sophisticated. This wasn't random. Whoever was behind this knew convoy procedures and how to bait responses. The second IED exploded not long after, this time closer to her own vehicle. Shrapnel whizzed past her cheek, slicing her temple, but she didn't even flinch. She ducked behind a rusted water tank and surveyed the field. That's when she saw them. Marines, frozen, wounded or pinned down, scattered too far from one another to mount a coordinated defense. And yet no one was moving to unite the squad. The radio was jammed. Communications were down. Most of the officers were either stunned or injured, and the ones still breathing weren't taking charge. Alara knew if she didn't act fast, they'd lose everyone. What happened next wasn't textbook. It was raw instinct, fueled by years of carrying more than her fair share of the load and being treated like she wasn't built for the job. She grabbed Corporal Vega and 2 privates and crawled into the open, ducking under fire to reach the pinned-down Marines near the front vehicle. She applied tourniquets on the fly, dragged 3 men to cover one by one, bullets slicing the air within inches. She was bleeding from her arm now, but she kept going, refusing to let her own body be an excuse to slow down. At one point, she pulled a Marine nearly twice her size across 30 yards of exposed ground, using only the strength in her shoulders and legs, yelling for others to return fire as she moved. The insurgents, realizing she was coordinating the defense, started focusing their fire on her. It only made her move faster. She fired back with precision, neutralizing 2 positions before vaulting over a sand berm to flank the final machine gun nest that had them pinned. She moved through the carnage like a ghost, like someone who had nothing left to prove, because proving herself was something she'd done every single day for the last decade. In the end, her leadership turned what would have been a massacre into a near-miraculous survival. 50 Marines made it out. Of the attackers, only silence remained where their ambush had failed. The medevac arrived 30 minutes later, by which time Alara had already stabilized 7 wounded men, coordinated a perimeter, and prepared a detailed sit-rep for the arriving support units. She was trembling by then, her blood loss severe, her breath ragged, but when they loaded her into the chopper, she refused the morphine. Not yet. Not until she made sure every name on her roster was accounted for. As they lifted into the sky, the desert spread beneath them like a battlefield scarred by both loss and courage. No one spoke. No one had words for what they'd just witnessed, except for one private, barely out of training, who muttered, voice choked with awe, "She saved us all." She wasn't too weak. She was the strongest one out there. The wind howled across the ravaged terrain as night fell, shadows stretching long across the battlefield where minutes had once felt like hours. The chaos of the last ambush still echoed in Fiona's mind, a looping reel of gunfire, smoke, screams, and adrenaline. Her body ached in every place imaginable, and her leg throbbed with a fire that made every step a battle of its own. But she kept moving, dragging a wounded corporal behind her with a makeshift sling, her rifle slung over her back in blood, some hers, some not, staining her uniform from collar to hem. No one could have expected that the woman once called too soft for combat would be the one navigating through an active kill zone, coordinating wounded extractions, rationing supplies, and holding the fragile line of morale together like a seamstress frantically stitching a torn flag. But Fiona had become exactly that. The night before, she had slept on gravel with one boot missing and a broken radio as her only company. Her breath had fogged in the cold air, and she'd used a torn piece of her uniform as a pillow. Now she was navigating toward the coordinates where the remaining unit was said to be holed up. After leading a dozen of them through a series of firefights and enemy skirmishes, she'd entrusted the rescued Marines to Sergeant Layton, whose arm was broken but whose spirit had finally returned, and turned back alone to find the last group. Most would have called it a death wish. Fiona saw it as unfinished duty. A map was etched into her mind like a tattoo now. Every bend in the terrain, every piece of abandoned equipment, every place where she had heard or seen movement. These all lived vividly behind her eyes. She slipped through crumbled bunkers and crawled beneath barbed wire as if her body was weightless, though her limbs screamed with every effort. When she finally reached the ruined shelter, its roof collapsed and its walls pockmarked with bullets, she found them, 5 Marines, 3 of them too injured to stand, 1 unconscious, and the 5th, Private Mason, barely holding it together with a jammed rifle and a half-empty canteen. He looked up when Fiona appeared and simply shook his head in disbelief. Not because it was her, but because it was anyone. He thought they'd been left for dead. Fiona gave no speech, offered no consolation. She simply knelt, did a quick assessment, and started preparing for transport. She used broken pieces of a stretcher to create 2 sled-like carriers. She stitched a tourniquet with the string from her tactical vest. And when Mason tried to say she should leave them and go get help, she stared him down with a silence that communicated more than 1,000 words. No one was being left behind. The journey back was like dragging time itself uphill. Every 100 yards they were forced to stop. Gunfire would break out in the distance, and Fiona would freeze, eyes wide, calculating where the shots came from and whether they were headed their way. At one point, they had to lie flat in a ditch for over an hour, unmoving, as 2 enemy scouts passed so close Fiona could see the stitching on their uniforms. She lay, with her body sprawled protectively over one of the wounded, her hand gripping a combat knife beneath her. But they didn't move, didn't breathe, didn't exist until the threat was gone. Only then did she rise, signaling for Mason to continue dragging the sled forward while she carried another on her back, their weight nearly unbearable. When she finally reached the temporary outpost where Leighton had taken the others, the reaction was a mix of awe and disbelief. Some whispered as she approached, others rushed to assist, and one Marine muttered, "She did it again," under his breath as if he were witnessing a ghost. By then, Fiona's leg had given out entirely, and the blood loss was becoming critical. She collapsed as soon as the last Marine was set down safely on a medical cot. Her body had pushed past human limits, but her mind had kept going until every life was accounted for. The medics had to forcibly restrain her to clean her wounds and stitch her gash. She kept mumbling names, checking and rechecking if everyone made it. Even in her dazed state, her sense of responsibility refused to let go. Command had finally received a scrambled message sent hours ago through a long-range relay that someone had jerry-rigged together using broken comms and a flare battery. Reinforcements were already on their way, but even with the weight of relief pressing down on everyone, Fiona wouldn't allow herself to rest until she had seen the wounded loaded up into evac vehicles and confirmed the full list of survivors. The final count? 52 Marines rescued or led to safety across 4 days of chaos, ambushes, injuries, and near starvation. And of those, nearly half credited Fiona directly with saving their lives, whether through medical intervention, strategic maneuvering, or simply refusing to abandon them when even hope had vanished. No one could believe it, not the officers who once dismissed her as unfit for combat, not the training instructors who told her she didn't have the edge, not the analysts who predicted 80% casualty under such conditions. Fiona had defied every expectation, not with brute force, but with strategy, grit, and a ferocious loyalty that made others believe again. And still, as the helicopters arrived and the wounded were carried aboard, Fiona sat on the edge of the tarmac, eyes scanning the horizon for any stragglers. Until the last rotor lifted, she remained alert, not a hero basking in glory, but a soldier doing her job. As the dust settled and the night finally fell silent, Fiona exhaled slowly, not out of relief, but out of readiness. There was still more ahead. There always would be. Ava's hands trembled slightly as she closed the encrypted laptop in the briefing room, her breath catching in her throat after what she'd just read. The mission parameters were more complicated than any she'd encountered before, and though she'd faced danger in countless forms over the past year, this operation would test her in ways she hadn't yet imagined. There were whispers around the base about how volatile the insurgent activity had become near the Saraban Ridge, a narrow but critical stretch of mountainous terrain used by both humanitarian convoys and military supply routes. The reports had grown more grim by the day: ambushes, planted IEDs, missing personnel. Now, a new threat had emerged. Intelligence suggested that a rogue militia faction, armed with U.S.-supplied weapons stolen from a hijacked convoy, had fortified themselves inside the ruins of an abandoned village perched atop the cliffs. What had once been a place of quiet resistance and agricultural resilience during the early war years had now become a bastion of aggression, and worse, it was just a few miles from a forward operating post where 50 Marines, mostly green replacements, were stationed. Ava's task was clear: perform reconnaissance with a small team, assess the scale of the entrenchment, and coordinate with base command for possible extraction or defense reinforcement. But what made it personal, what burned like a slow ember in her chest, was the knowledge that Lieutenant Hassan, the same one who'd once told her women didn't belong in the line of fire, was now the ranking officer in charge of that vulnerable outpost. She didn't say a word about that detail to her team. It wasn't about vindication, it was about responsibility. The lives of 50 Marines, and potentially hundreds more down the line, depended on her ability to stay focused, level-headed, and precise. As her small recon unit mobilized and headed into the narrowing valleys that led to the Saraban Ridge, Ava's instincts took over like second nature. Each breath she took was measured, each movement controlled. Her team had come to trust her not just because of her record, but because she never asked them to take a risk she wasn't willing to take herself. She was the first to dismount and sweep the path for IEDs, the last to rest, the one who double-checked every piece of intelligence, and the one who always stayed calm even when the situation turned chaotic. As they approached the ridge under the cover of darkness, Ava caught sight of the flickering shadows cast by makeshift floodlights below the cliffs. Through her scope, she could make out at least a dozen armed figures patrolling the perimeter, most likely guarding stashes of stolen weaponry and supplies. There were no signs of friendly presence nearby, which only heightened the urgency in her gut. But what she hadn't anticipated was the presence of long-range jamming signals. As soon as they set up surveillance equipment and tried to transmit a data burst back to base, their comms flatlined. Every device was rendered useless within minutes. The digital silence was deafening. It meant they couldn't call for backup, couldn't confirm their location, and couldn't receive orders. They were truly on their own. Ava's second-in-command, Corporal Jules Tegan, a wiry comms specialist with years of experience, looked to her for direction, concern flashing in his eyes. She didn't hesitate. She made the call to split the team in two, one group to maintain distant surveillance, the other to proceed down the ridge under cover and try to infiltrate one of the buildings to manually extract intel. She chose to lead the second group herself. They made their way down the ravine, slowly, silently, stepping around crumbling rocks and broken pottery from the once thriving village now reduced to husks of walls and scorched timber. Every sound was amplified in the darkness: the shift of a boot, the clink of a weapon buckle, even the rhythmic heartbeat thudding in Ava's ears. They reached the edge of one structure with partially intact walls and peered inside. It was exactly what they feared. Crates of U.S.-marked rifles, pallets of medical gear, and maps with marked target locations lay scattered in the room. Ava took photos quickly, knowing time was limited. Then came the sudden flicker of a motion sensor, a soft clicking sound, a metallic whir, and the terrifying realization that they'd triggered a silent alarm. The enemy was moving fast. Ava ordered her team to split and fall back to Extraction Point Echo, the rendezvous agreed upon prior to descent. But the enemy was closing in with alarming speed. Ava stayed behind, moving through debris and shadow like a ghost, buying precious seconds as she disrupted paths, jammed doors, and used her training to lead the pursuers away from her team. As she darted through the wreckage, she found herself inside a stone structure that still had a partially intact roof. She braced herself against a crumbled archway, weapon drawn, listening as footsteps pounded nearer. 2 enemy fighters entered. Ava waited for her moment, calculated angles, then moved with surgical precision, taking one down instantly and grappling the other into unconsciousness. She knew she couldn't stay there. Reinforcements were surely coming. But as she began to move again, an explosion ripped through the western wall of the structure. Dust and fire flooded the air, and Ava was thrown back, ears ringing, vision blurred. A secondary blast, possibly from one of the weapon crates, shook the ground moments later. She crawled, bloodied and disoriented, toward a patch of open sky. Every inch she dragged herself felt like a mile. She could barely hear her own breathing, but she reached for the flare in her belt, the emergency one kept for absolute worst-case scenarios. With trembling fingers, she struck it. A red beam sliced the night sky, and then everything went black. The next morning, the air hung heavy with a stillness that seemed to anticipate chaos. As the horizon began to blush with the first signs of dawn, Elise stood atop a dirt ridge, overlooking the temporary outpost the Marines had secured overnight. Her face was streaked with ash, her uniform soaked in sweat and grit, but her eyes were clear. The skirmishes of the previous day had left their mark. 3 wounded, 1 missing in action, and a shattered morale that hung over the platoon like a ghost. Elise hadn't slept. She'd spent the night checking wounds, reinforcing sandbag barriers, and scribbling coordinates and notes in her field journal, her hands trembling but steady. She kept going because she had to. Because nobody else would. Because that's what leaders do when everyone else is looking for someone to follow. She found herself staring at the map once again, tracing the perimeter they had tried to hold. The enemy's tactics had grown bolder. These weren't just random attacks. They were coordinated, precise. Whoever was on the other side of those tree lines knew American formations, knew when they'd be most vulnerable, and knew exactly where to strike. Elise's instincts told her that something bigger was brewing, that the past few days were merely a setup. They weren't trying to overrun them. They were hurting them. She could feel it in her bones. Captain Reeve returned from a communications relay meeting with High Command, his face pale. He summoned Elise into the command tent, and his voice was low, grave. "There's intel suggesting a major offensive is being planned against us tonight, possibly hundreds of them. They want this outpost erased." Elise felt the pit in her stomach tighten. They were barely holding on with the current numbers. Most of their defensive drones had run out of charge, and several vehicles had been damaged or rendered useless. Morale was fragile, and worst of all, there was no guarantee of immediate reinforcements. The other units were spread thin, engaged in parallel operations across a wide zone. Reeves' voice cracked slightly when he added, "They want us to hold this position at all costs until sunrise tomorrow. That's 8 hours from the first wave." Elise didn't hesitate. "We'll do it," she said, "but we'll need to rethink our setup. Let me coordinate the fallback traps." Reeve nodded with reluctant agreement. "You've earned that," he said quietly. With just hours left, Elise sprang into action. She reorganized the perimeter defense teams, consolidated the wounded to a single secure bunker with 2 trained medics, and distributed the last of the ammunition and MREs with mechanical efficiency. Her plan was audacious. They would use the terrain against the enemy. She studied every contour, every line of sight. The collapsed ravine on the west side could serve as a choke point. The wrecked supply convoy could be turned into an explosive trap. The field of shattered Humvees? Perfect for drawing them in, before triggering thermal detonators buried beneath. But she also knew that none of it would work unless her team believed. She stood atop the central ridge at 1,800 hours, facing the entire group, about 57 Marines now, hardened, tired, skeptical. She didn't raise her voice. Instead, she spoke with raw honesty. "I know many of you didn't believe I deserved to lead," she said. "And maybe I wasn't supposed to be here in the first place. But I am here now. With you. Not behind you, not above you. With you. And I'm not leaving, even if it means I'm the last one standing. We can survive this night. not by luck, but by grit, by smarts, and by fighting together. If you follow the plan, if we hold that line, we see the sunrise, all of us. There was a silence, then a slow nod from Sergeant Pena, then another from Corporal Dorsey. One by one, heads began to turn, eyes meeting hers, not just with duty, but trust. The shift was almost imperceptible, but real. They would follow her now. As darkness swallowed the last of the daylight, Elise took her position in the center command trench, a modified observation post with a narrow line of sight across the battlefield. She triple-checked the encrypted radio link, reviewed the detonator grid, and counted her remaining rounds. 47 for her rifle, 2 grenades, 1 combat knife. It would have to be enough. The first wave struck just after 2,100 hours. It started with noise, distant shouting, then smoke, then the sharp staccato of gunfire echoing off trees. Elise held her breath until the enemy broke through the mist, and then she triggered the first minefield. The boom rattled the ground, sending fragments of dirt and metal into the sky. Screams followed, but they kept coming. Rounds screamed overhead. Elise relayed orders with unflinching clarity, redirecting fire teams, authorizing fallback traps, coordinating the medics. At 2,200, they lost contact with one southern squad. She made the call to collapse that flank and seal the approach. Cold, fast decisions that meant sacrificing a position to preserve lives. At midnight, their fuel stores were hit, triggering a secondary explosion that rocked the entire base. Several Marines were buried in the collapse. Elise dug with her own hands to pull one of them out, a 19-year-old recruit who whispered through bloodied lips, "I didn't think we'd make it this long." "We're not done," she told him. At 03:00, the enemy launched what Elise knew was the final push. Dozens of them poured in from the eastern tree line. This time, they had armor. Makeshift tanks, heavy gunners. The last of their own drone systems were down, and the air support had been grounded due to storm interference. Elise gave the order to initiate the fallback burn. The entire forward line ignited, using stored flammables to create a wall of fire across the approach. The blaze turned night to day. Amid the inferno, Elise spotted a figure moving toward her position, someone carrying a wounded Marine on their back. It was Dorsey. He collapsed at her feet, both of them laughing and crying at once. As the fire died down and the remaining enemies fell back, what was left was silence. Elise looked around. Of the original force, 50 Marines had survived, most wounded, all exhausted, but alive. Against all odds they had held the line, and now the world would hear about it. By the time the dust began to settle and the distant rattle of gunfire finally faded into the hush of the desert wind, Elise stood quietly near the base perimeter, her shoulders squared, her eyes steady, and her gears still dusted in the remnants of the morning's firefight. News of what she had done had spread faster than even she could comprehend. Marines from across the base, some of whom had barely acknowledged her before, now stared at her with wide, astonished eyes, some offering hesitant nods, others stepping aside in the narrow walkways like they were passing a monument. But Elise didn't revel in the newfound attention. Her hands were still stained from carrying the wounded, and her mind was heavy with the weight of those she couldn't save. There was no glory in what had happened. There was only the clarity that when it had mattered most, she didn't run. The others had filed back hours after the main assault ended, some too ashamed to look her in the eye, others clearly overwhelmed by what had happened. The commanding officers, who had once questioned her place in combat, now saw her differently. Captain Granger approached her quietly, his face unreadable, but his eyes softened by something close to respect. He didn't offer her a medal, not yet, and she didn't expect one. Instead, he simply asked her to walk with him, and together they made their way to the command tent. Inside, Elise was met with silence and a round table of senior officers who had pored over the operation's outcome. Charts and satellite images were still spread across the surface, with red marks circling ambush points, fallback zones, and the exact location where Elise had dug in and held her ground. They asked her to recount what happened. She did, without embellishment, just the facts. How she'd seen the ambush unfold, how she'd made the decision to act on instinct rather than wait for an order, how she managed to radio in coordinates while holding the line with 3 injured Marines pressed against her cover, and how she coordinated the return fire that gave the others enough time to recover and re-engage. There was no tremble in her voice, but there was no pride in it either. She spoke like someone who had lived through fire, not someone who was seeking a spotlight. When she finished, the room remained silent. It wasn't the stunned silence of disbelief. It was the silence of recognition. They didn't need to say it aloud. Elise had done what no one else could or would. She had shifted the trajectory of that battle with nothing but her training, grit, and the kind of courage you couldn't teach. After the debriefing, the officers excused her, and Captain Granger walked her back to her quarters. On the way, he stopped and handed her a small black box. Inside was a temporary commendation, a prelude to something more formal that would come later. But more than the medal, what meant something to Elise was the simple sentence he uttered as he handed it over. "You proved all of us wrong." That night, Elise sat on her cot, the box unopened beside her, the voices of the base quiet for once. In her hand, she held a photo of her brother Marcus, who had once told her that no battle was ever truly won with strength alone. It was always courage that decided the outcome. She whispered a thank you to him under her breath, then placed the photo back into her chest pocket. The following days passed quickly. Official reports were filed, names were listed, and those who had survived were recognized. Elise's name appeared at the top of every commendation list, not just for her actions under fire, but for the lives she saved by refusing to retreat. The base chapel held a memorial for the 3 Marines who didn't make it. Elise stood at attention with the rest, her eyes fixed forward as the names were read aloud. It was there that Sergeant Porter, one of the most vocal skeptics of her presence in the field, approached her afterward. He didn't offer an apology. Elise didn't expect one, but he did shake her hand, his grip firm, his expression solemn. That handshake meant more than words ever could. For the first time, Elise began to feel what she had longed for since joining the Corps. Not just respect, but belonging. She was no longer a question mark in the unit. She was a defining presence, a reminder of what resolve looked like when tested in its purest form. As the unit began preparations for their next assignment, Elise was brought into planning briefings, not as a token representative, but as a critical strategist. Her insights were sought, her experience valued, and her voice carried weight. Younger recruits began to approach her, not just to shake her hand, but to ask questions, to learn. She took the time to answer each one, remembering what it felt like to be overlooked and underestimated. In every moment, she carried herself with quiet confidence, never boasting, never gloating. Her reputation wasn't built on stories, it was built on action, and everyone knew it. As she walked through the base one afternoon, a fresh wave of recruits arrived, disembarking from their transport. Among them was a young woman, slight in build but with a spark in her eyes. Elise caught her looking her way and offered a small nod. The girl hesitated, then smiled. In that brief moment, Elise saw the full circle. What had started as her personal battle had become something larger. She wasn't just a Marine anymore, she was a symbol. The desert winds had quieted as if pausing to bear witness to what had transpired. Elise stood among the smoldering remnants of what had once been a deadly battlefield, her frame covered in dust and blood, not all of it her own. The sun cast long shadows across the sand, illuminating the wreckage of the ambush that had brought so many to the brink of death and exposed the raw truth of her character. As the medevac helicopters touched down, their blades cutting the air with mechanical urgency, Elise helped load the wounded, her movements steady, despite the trembling in her limbs. One by one, the men she had saved were airlifted to safety, and with every stretcher lifted into the air, a part of her rose with them. not in escape, but in recognition of what she had fought so long to prove. Later that evening, the base was subdued, the adrenaline replaced by solemn reflection. Word had already begun to spread, not through official channels, but through hushed conversations and wide-eyed retellings from the lips of the very Marines who had once doubted her. They spoke of the moment the ambush hit, of the confusion and chaos, of how most had scattered under orders to retreat and regroup, but they lingered on Elise, on how she had stood her ground, organized a countermeasure, shielded the wounded, and held her position until backup arrived. No one could deny the facts anymore. The rumors had been replaced by reverence. Elise wasn't just brave, she was the reason dozens of them had made it home. In the aftermath, she was called in for debriefing, but this time, it wasn't just a clinical review of protocol. High-ranking officers sat in silence as she recounted the events in detail, their eyes betraying a mixture of awe and regret. General Harkness, the same man who had once questioned her deployment to the front lines, listened with an expression that shifted slowly from stoic to humbled. When she finished, he didn't speak for a moment. Then, with a tone far quieter than his usual command presence, he thanked her, not just for her service, but for proving him wrong in the most extraordinary way. Recognition came swiftly. Within days, news of her actions had reached Pentagon circles and media outlets. Journalists clamored for statements, wanting to feature the woman who had turned the tide of a deadly ambush with grit, instinct, and unrelenting courage. But Elise wasn't interested in headlines. She kept her answers brief, redirecting attention to her fellow Marines and the ones they had lost. Her humility in the face of overwhelming praise only deepened the respect people held for her. She became a symbol, yes, but not because she had sought the spotlight. She became a symbol because she had done the unthinkable, not to prove herself, but to protect others. At a special ceremony 2 weeks later, Elise stood before an assembly of military personnel, journalists, and civilian leaders. Her uniform was immaculate, though her boots still bore faint stains from the battlefield she'd barely escaped. As the Medal of Valor was pinned to her chest by the Secretary of Defense, a wave of emotion coursed through her. Not pride, exactly, but something quieter, something deeper. It was the affirmation of everything she had fought against. Every condescending smirk, every doubting gaze, every moment she had to work twice as hard for half the recognition, they all melted into insignificance in that moment. Not because the medal validated her, but because she knew now that her actions had spoken louder than any doubt ever could. Among the audience were the Marines she had saved. Some stood, still bandaged, others sat in wheelchairs, their faces raw with emotion. They cheered, not out of protocol but from the heart. Many of them had told her in private how wrong they had been, how sorry they were for the way they had treated her in the past. But Elise never responded with bitterness. She forgave them with a nod, a pat on the shoulder, a quiet, "I'm just glad you're here." It wasn't about revenge or vindication for her. It never had been. It was about service, duty, honor. Later that night, alone in her quarters, she sat with a photo of her father, Major Conrad Leclerc, the man whose death had set her on this path. She whispered her gratitude into the silence, a soft promise that his legacy had not been forgotten. She had taken the weight of his name, of his sacrifice, and turned it into a force of her own, a legacy reborn in action, not in anger. But the story didn't end there. Elise knew the battle wasn't over. Not the kind fought with weapons, but the one waged in minds and systems. She began advocating quietly, but persistently, for better training opportunities, more equal promotion tracks, and policy reforms within the military. Not for herself, but for every soldier like her who had been overlooked or underestimated. Her voice, once dismissed in strategy rooms, now carried weight. When she spoke, people listened. And somewhere far away, in a training camp where a new batch of recruits was just arriving, her name was spoken with reverence. Not as a myth, but as a mentor. A woman who had walked through the fire when others ran, who had turned mockery into medals, and suspicion into salvation. For many, she wasn't just a soldier anymore. She was the proof that strength didn't have to look like what they'd been taught. It could be calm, precise, unflinching. It could be Elise Leclerc. The halls of Fort Durham were silent now, long after the thunder of battle had faded into memory, and the medevac choppers had lifted off the blood-stained sand for the final time. Olivia Vance stood at the center of the parade field, a patch of hardened soil she had once run across during boot camp, now adorned with flags at half-mast and folding chairs arranged for a private ceremony. She wore her Class A uniform, the rows of ribbons on her chest, not just decoration, but symbols of the fire she had walked through. Her Medal of Valor shone against the deep green of her jacket, but the most poignant honor pinned to her heart was the simple golden brooch from Lieutenant Colonel Brooks, the one he had left behind, blood-stained and bent, found clutched in his hand after Olivia had pulled him from the rubble. Word had spread like wildfire in the weeks that followed the siege at Black Hollow. 50 Marines saved, a rogue insurgent faction disbanded. A single Marine who stood her ground when others fled, who reloaded until her fingers bled, who ran into explosions rather than away. Yet Olivia never let the press shape her identity. When reporters begged for interviews, she deferred to her unit. When dignitaries requested photo ops, she asked that the names of her fallen friends be printed beside hers. The Marines from Echo Company, what was left of them, knew the truth. Not just about that day, but about everything that came before it. They knew the prejudice she had endured. They knew the silent battles she'd fought against labels, the comments muttered behind closed doors, the years of having to prove herself over and over. But they also knew how she'd rewritten the rules of resilience. How she had shown, without ever raising her voice or boasting of her worth, that strength wasn't defined by bulk or rank, but by heart, instinct, and an unrelenting will to protect. After the chaos settled, the Department of Defense launched an official inquiry into the failed command structure that left Echo Company exposed that day. Olivia's detailed report, compiled with painful precision and humility, didn't seek vengeance, but accountability. She emphasized the systemic gaps, the lack of communication between intelligence and boots on the ground, and how her own early warnings had gone unheeded. The result was sweeping changes in field reporting protocols and a new tactical awareness training series developed based on her decisions during the siege. They called it Vance Protocol, a name she protested, but one the Pentagon insisted on. More important to Olivia than any medal or doctrine named in her honor was what came after. She took a voluntary reassignment as an instructor at the Combat Training Academy, not in a cushy desk job, but on the field, face-to-face with new recruits, especially the women, the overlooked, the quiet ones. She trained them hard, just as she had trained herself, but she also listened. She became the kind of leader she had longed for in her own early days, one who saw past stereotypes, one who caught subtle signs of doubt before they became deadly hesitations, one who reminded her trainees that courage was not the absence of fear, but the refusal to be controlled by it. Months later, a special graduation ceremony was held for her first all-female squad, one she had led from orientation through advanced field tactics. She didn't plan to speak, but as they gathered around her at the edge of the range, she saw the same fire in their eyes that had once burned inside her, a hunger to belong, to prove, to lead. So she told them the truth, about the day she stood alone in Black Hollow, about the fear that nearly paralyzed her, about the voices that told her to run, and about the decision to stay, not because she believed she would win, but because she couldn't bear the thought of letting others die when she still had strength to fight. That truth rippled through them more deeply than any textbook could. Her words became folklore in that academy. They called it the stand, not just the moment Olivia had drawn her weapon against an ambush, but the moment she had chosen to stand for something greater than herself. Years passed, and Olivia retired from the Corps with honors that filled a 3-page citation. But she never lost the edge. Civilians approached her in coffee shops, young girls stared in awe at her service pins, and veterans saluted her out of respect deeper than rank. Still, Olivia remained grounded. She spent her retirement building mentorship programs for underrepresented cadets and writing curriculum reforms to make military training more inclusive and effective. Occasionally, she returned to the site of Black Hollow, now memorialized with a marble plaque listing all 50 Marines she had helped save and the dozen who had not made it out. She'd kneel, touch each engraved name, and whisper her silent promise to never let their memory be reduced to numbers. In her quiet moments, she'd think back to when she was still Olivia the rejected, Olivia the fragile, Olivia the weak. Those labels no longer held any weight, not because they were erased, but because she had burned through them, turned them to ash with her actions, her choices, and her sacrifice. She had become something far greater. Olivia Vance had been called too weak for combat. She'd been told she would break, fold, retreat. Instead, she stood when others fell, roared when others were silent, and carried 50 lives on her back through the smoke and fire. She didn't just survive. She redefined survival. And in doing so, she became not just a soldier or a hero, but a symbol of what it truly means to lead. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.